Hello, U.S. History, and welcome to another Barella's videos. This is our last video lecture for Unit 3, and it is about reform. So we're looking at the progressives and how this movement of progressive people are going to target their efforts into certain areas. We've spent, I feel, a lot of time in Unit 3 looking at some of the problems of our inner cities, some of the problems due to population increases, immigration, just having so many people in such a small area. We saw how it gets very dirty, how it's very crowded, and we also are looking at some of the social problems that are happening. So this video is going to address some of those key ideas and how we're going to fix them in the early 20th century, so early 1900s. So to start, I want to just read this. You don't have to write this down, but we talked about the meat industry. We looked at The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. So that clearly needs to be reformed. But what are some of the other areas of the Gilded Age, this age of industrialization, that need to be reformed? We're going to look at about 4 of those areas right now. So the first one is the aid to urban poor. And there's a movement within the progressive movement that's called the social gospel or the social gospel movement. And basically, this is going to be a group of individuals, kind of a combination of church officials and clergy, but also regular citizens who are pretty committed to their faith. And they basically feel like it's their job to put the Bible into action. So they follow the Bible's teachings and they want to focus on charity and justice and just helping their fellow citizens who are struggling. And they feel like by doing this, by offering some aid and assistance without any obligation, they feel like they are going to create a new society, or what they were calling a kingdom of God. And the hope was that they're reforming humanity. And basically, the group that people that were very committed to the social gospel, you can see here in this picture of a soup kitchen, these were basically churches who are sponsoring food banks or areas where people can get food for free. And the hope is that by doing that, they're not only helping their fellow humans, but they're also showing like what humanity can be and trying to be a role model and trying to encourage others to help. So that's called the social gospel. So they will create charities where they can donate food and clothing, where they can offer resources to help people find jobs. But that's one example of how people who are just regular people are trying to step up and help others. Another area when it comes to helping the urban poor is something we have talked about, which is the settlement house movement. And I know you're going to read about this in your textbook too. The settlement house movement, in my mind, is basically like our early forms of community centers. They are basically part of a movement created by a woman named Jane Addams. She lived in Chicago, and she was basically a pretty wealthy woman. She was single. She didn't have a husband or a family. So she basically wanted to use her energy and her time and her money to help others. And she was looking at immigrant communities near Chicago, and she was trying to see how can she help these families. And she realized what they need is help with daycare. They need help with someone to watch their children while they're trying to work. They need help learning the language. So she sets up these classes where women are going to be taught English, and they can then sort of take that language translation to their families. She will have friends who are doctors come in and basically do health screenings for the people of the neighborhood. They will offer kindergarten classes, daycare classes, just basic education to neighborhoods that really kind of have been ignored or overlooked. And again, all of this is paid for by Jane Addams personally and her doing some fundraising efforts among, let's face it, her rich friends. And the one thing I feel like is important to know about the progressive movement of this time period, the early 1900s, is that these are people they're pretty rich, to be honest. And some of them might be middle class, but some of them might be upper middle class or upper class. But the point is, they have the resources to actually help. And so I don't knock them for being rich. I feel like, if anything, they're a good example for what maybe the rich in our society could do today, which is really kind of look at the problems and use some of their funds to help people and expect nothing in return. Jane Addams was not looking for awards. She was not looking for recognition. In fact, she wanted to copy settlement houses in other cities around the country, and it works. So I almost think of Jane Addams as one of our first social workers because what she is doing is what has now become the occupation of social work. So that is Jane Addams and the settlement house movement. Another topic I want to look at, speaking of children, is going to be education. Because at the end of the 1800s, for the first time really in our country's history, there is going to be a push and actual laws passed that require children under a certain age to be in school. We call this compulsory education, which is like mandatory education. Now, at this time, I feel like honestly, I think the age was 14 or 16. So it's still pretty young. But the idea is that we're going to require kids to go to school and not go to work because in the long run, they need an education. Which then leads us to the debate over what is that education going to look like? Because now, obviously, we have set classes we take. But many people debated, should our education focus on arts and literature, maths and science, facts, or creativity? And the answer, what we like to think, is all of it, that it should all be a part of education. And this is where we're going to start to see the first public schools built that are free, that you attend for free, that are paid for by tax dollars. And that's the schools. That's basically the beginnings of the school system that we have here in Santa Clarita. Okay, so again, that's probably like late 1800s is when those first laws are passed. Let's talk about working conditions. We've talked a little bit about workers' rights and labor unions forming. Some of the biggest advances for labor unions in this unit is going to be looking at workday limits. So 8-hour workdays, at most a 10-hour workday, which is definitely an improvement. You will see factories start to have to pay attention to working conditions and making their factories safer. You will see slow advances in pay and increases for workers' wages. And in the video that we were watching about the fire in the sewing, the shirt making factory, those kinds of safety measurements have, unfortunately, as tragedies like that happen, they lead to our factories and workplaces becoming safer. Also, the debate on pay. I know here in California, our minimum wage is actually higher than the federal minimum wage. But again, that's always up for debate how much workers should get paid as a minimum. And then we have to look at government reform. And when I talk about this, I mean, what rights as citizens that you have. So, for example, we're going to start to see more use of what's called a direct primary. Now, I know this is going to be brought up a lot next year in your government class, so I'm going to try to keep this really simple. Basically, a direct primary is where you as a citizen vote and you get to help elect who the nominees are. I feel like the primary system is kind of like round one of the playoffs. So like you kind of you qualify for the playoffs. So now here's round one, and you sort of narrow down the playing field of nominees. And then the general election is where you actually vote between who are your two candidates or three candidates, depending on the office. So we have a California primary for basically the Democrats and the Republicans to narrow down their choices, and then our general election is what we're going to be what we're having actually in November of this year. Another idea that comes to sort of light in this time period is the use of what's called an initiative. An initiative is just basically a fancy way to propose a new law. So here in California, you saw with the election all the propositions. Propositions are basically like initiatives. They're kind of the same thing. But you as a citizen have the right to write them. Get it? There's a pun there. Another idea is something called a referendum, which is a little bit more complicated. But a referendum is basically kind of like initiatives also. But as a voter, you can approve or reject a law if it's put to the citizens to vote. And when that's happening, they usually call it a referendum. They don't call it a proposition. They don't happen as often, but they are available. And that is something that citizens can have some say in. And then finally, we have the recall, which is something that actually has happened here in California. A recall is where you actually, as citizens, begin a movement, kind of through an initiative, to remove a public servant from office before the end of their term. So I know you weren't even born yet, but there was a governor in California. His name was Gray Davis. He was elected as governor, and he rose prices for licenses, like licensing fees, registration, a lot of taxes. And the people were so angry that they actually led a recall. And no joke, it was led by Arnold Schwarzenegger, and the voters recalled Governor Gray Davis, so he did not finish his term as governor. And then through a special election, the people of California elected Arnold Schwarzenegger our governor. So it happens, it's real. All right, I'm going to stop there with our reform. So again, just kind of hitting upon some key areas. We're going to revisit the progressives at the beginning of Unit 4 after we take this test. So don't forget to do your notes, get ready for notebook check, and I will see you in class.